Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I have started the recording, so everybody knows that this webinar is being recorded. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Dr. Amber Idle. I'm the Washington State veterinarian, and I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to get together today to discuss the federal order regarding HPAI and dairy cattle. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If along this journey you have trouble hearing me or you're having trouble, I can turn my video off because I know it has been a problem for me some today. So I just wanted to make folks aware of that. So everybody see my presentation okay? Might need a verbal because I can't see the screen.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. So
Yes.
it's great to see some familiar faces out there today. Thank you.
I cannot see your presentation.
Okay.
Me neither. I can just see people.
Same,
Try it again.
same here.
Oh, of course. Let's see. Share screen.
There we go.
There you
Thank
go.
you.
Perfect.
Woohoo! All right, I guess that let a couple more people into the meeting. Okay, let's try it this way. Are we good? Sorry for the technical difficulties. So for the folks who just joined, thank you for joining the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. And today we're here to talk about highly pathogenic avian influenza in dairy cattle and the recent federal order that was implemented. And we're here mostly to be a high-level overview and try to answer some of your questions regarding this. I do want to mention that this is an evolving situation. This has been our theme all along, and things continue to change. So even within this federal order and the guidance documents that were released today, we anticipate there will be additional changes, maybe even through the weekend. So we are struggling to implement this by Monday, full steam ahead, but we're going to do our best and at least let you know what to expect in the coming days and weeks with regards to this order. All right, so just for those of you who don't know anything about the State Veterinarian's Office, I just want to give you a very high-level overview of what we do. So our mission at the State Vet's Office is to protect and enhance animal health and well-being, protect the economic viability of our industry through disease detection, containment, and eradication, because that does secure trade access for us, and also to safeguard public health. So when it comes to highly pathogenic avian influenza, it's certainly a disease that kind of fits into all of those priorities for us in our mission. So what we're going to talk about today is highly pathogenic avian influenza, and just to remind folks about those migratory pathways and how birds are constantly moving up and down our coasts and borders and how they move virus. So every year we anticipate that migratory waterfowl are going to carry avian influenza viruses. Some years they're low pathogenic, sometimes they're highly pathogenic, and it just so happens that the strain we're dealing with now has been hanging out for about 2 years. Hasn't reassorted in the ways that we were hoping to go from that highly pathogenic strain back to a low pathogenic strain. So as you can see and appreciate in the Pacific Flyway, when they kind of get in the summer months, when they head up to Alaska, they kind of go on dates with their friends from the other flyways, from the Asian flyways, from over in the European flyways, and they reassort and they mix viruses. And so we are seeing that this virus has impacted 50 plus countries across the world. So right now it is kind of a global disease and something that we're all dealing with for a very long time. I would say Europe's probably been dealing with it for about 18 months longer than we have, and we're going into our 3rd year. So unfortunately, we haven't seen things change. However, in the last 2 years, since the beginning of this outbreak, we've had 48 affected states with over 1,100 premises become positive. And you'll see on this map that just came out today, these are indications. Every one of those kind of green boxes indicates a place where we've had a detection and it's been resolved. So our surveillance zones have been closed after response. Anything that's in orange is still in a surveillance zone. And then anything that's in red is a recent detection. So they're probably still undergoing a depopulation process. The ones that are on this map represent commercial flocks that have had recent detections across those 4 states. In Washington State, we haven't had a detection since December, but we have had 46 detections across 17 counties in our state. And it continues to persist in wild bird populations and wild carnivorous mammals. We continue to get detections. So we know it's here. And I think what's really important for people to remember is HPAI is pretty much ubiquitous in the environment. We've been dealing with a long time. We have a high environmental load. And so we're going to continue to see detections, and we anticipate with migration occurring, we will continue to see detections even perhaps in backyard or commercial flocks. So we're continuing to monitor that situation. What we have seen is that what this is whole genomic sequencing. And so this came from the National Veterinary Services Laboratory, and they're starting to share all their sequencing data. And if you really like to dork out on this, there's a website called GSAID, and all of the sequences are being shared at the global level. And what the whole genomic sequencing helps us to understand is whether these infections are point source infections or whether these infections have occurred through lateral transmission. And what we're seeing is, as of right now, 83% of the poultry detections in the United States have been through point source detection. So I think it speaks to the fact that we have a lot of birds, a lot of species. I think there's 60 different species of wild birds that are carrying this virus. And we've also seen it appear in 16 different carnivorous mammals. And so what we're seeing is more opportunities for those point source infections where biosecurity isn't necessarily going to be the answer. So these whole genomic sequences kind of point to the relationship between those viruses and how they're being spread. And this has become really interesting and recently as we're starting to see transmission possibly occurring between dairy farms and poultry farms or vice versa, and we don't really understand how that's happening. So this is a nice graph to just kind of show you trends over time and what we're seeing in seasonality with this. Certainly in 2022, when we first saw this virus, we had a huge number of infected premises kind of in that during that spring migration period when all of our bird populations were pretty naive. And so we saw quite a spike, and then we sort of saw it die out in the summertime and then spike again during fall migration. You can see that here we are in 2024 in gray, and we're starting to see it go up a tiny bit, but nothing like what it was in 2022 when this started. But we're expecting that we'll continue to see positive flocks as migration occurs, and we're seeing so many spillover events now into mammals. So we definitely are concerned about that. The good thing is we have Dr. Dana Dobbs, who's our avian health lead, and she's worked very closely with our commercial flocks to make sure that they're really enhancing their biosecurity plans on farm to keep this virus out. And they've been wildly successful to date, and I hope that they continue to be. But it's taken a lot of hard work to get there. So what we expect, certainly, after we've had this virus here in Washington, in the United States for this long of 2 years, we expect over time we're going to see spillover from wildlife into agriculture. So we've seen that, as we mentioned, into our commercial industries. We've been very fortunate in Washington State to just have one commercial flock detection. All of the other 45 were backyard flocks. I'm not saying that was any easier, but they had pretty significant epidemiological links with just direct contact with wild waterfowl or sharing feed sources or direct contact with a shared pond or something along those lines. But now it's been here for a long time. We are continuing to see spillover into other species. Many of you are aware of the spillover into goats in Minnesota. That was on a HPAI positive poultry flock or backyard flock where those goats were, really had a high load of virus that they were being exposed to. And those neonatal goats did develop neurologic signs, but it didn't seem to impact the adult animals. That was the only spillover event we've heard of in goats. But certainly now we're seeing it in dairy cattle, which is very concerning. And really the ultimate concern, as we all know, is whether this could spill over into humans and create the next global pandemic. So we all appreciate that influenza viruses are very adaptive to different species. And right now we've seen this virus spill over from wild birds into whales, seals here in Washington State, turkeys. We've seen it in carnivorous mammals, including dogs and cats, along with other carnivorous mammals. And we've seen it spill over once into humans. So we're not quite there yet, but I think the big concern from CDC is that, we're going to have this opportunity for this virus to reassort and cause the next global pandemic. I think a lot of people still have post-traumatic stress disorder from COVID-19, and there's certainly a concern about whether this next pandemic could be zoonotic in nature. I think we do have the perfect storm here in Washington. And for those veterinarians that are on the call that serve those backyard producers or that have hobby farms that have a lot of different species on their farm. I think we've all seen it, where they have, a raw milk cow in the backyard, and they've got some chickens, and they've got ducks, and then they've got a pond, and everything's free range, and then they've got this really cool coony pig, and then they've got a sick kid with a snotty nose, and they're all hanging out together. So we kind of have the perfect storm for what could be kind of a disaster. So it's just something we want to be aware of. I don't think we need to panic, but certainly we are concerned to see this spillover event and see this virus persist this long and provide other opportunities for reassortment in other species. So right now, we have seen spillover into 16 different carnivorous mammals in the United States. We're continuing to see detections in wild carnivorous mammals here in Washington, including a bobcat and some skunks in the last month or so, and also those birds of prey, things like eagles, falcons, so on and so forth, that may be predating on sick or dead birds in the environment. And we also know that a lot of those waterfowl are not going to be clinical, but can carry the virus. So we have a lot of subclinical carrier wild birds out there that could also be causing a problem for us. So it's not a super big surprise. I mean, I don't think anybody saw this coming, right? But this spillover event into dairy is not something we expected. And we certainly didn't see it coming that it would exhibit itself in the way that it is. So I think, in all those carnivorous mammals, we've pretty much seen replication of that virus in the brain, and it's caused those animals to become neurologic and die, particularly in neonatal animals. We've seen the same even in geese. And some of the wild bird die-offs we've had, including Caspian terns this past fall, was kind of a mass mortality event out on Rat Island. So this is a little bit more unusual that these animals do not seem to exhibit clinical signs that are consistent with that. They are not neurologic. It doesn't seem to impact neonates the way it does in others. Instead, this virus seems to be mammary trophic, so it really likes the mammary gland. It seems to be replicating there. And it seems to be impacting those animals that are really producing a lot of milk. So in those tissues that are producing the milk, they're also giving that virus an opportunity to really replicate in that tissue. It seems like not all animals get sick. And so what we're hearing from USDA is that in this particular outbreak, we're seeing even cows that can have opportunistic localized infections in a single quarter in the udder. It doesn't have to be everything. It can just be a quarter. So much like we think about mastitis type transmission in organisms, we kind of see it occurring similarly in the cow in that way. As I mentioned before, one of the concerns we do have based on those whole genomic sequencing is whether there's a relationship between how poultry farms are also becoming infected. So in the last 30 days, these 3 states have had detections in commercial poultry facilities. And when they've done the whole genomic sequencing, it's sequencing out to look pretty much the same. And so there is some evidence that there is some movement of this identical virus going between those facilities, but we're not really sure how, especially if in cattle, it's primarily spread and shed through milk. We're not really sure how milk might be moving onto a commercial poultry facility. So, there's a lot of thoughts that could be lateral transmission, but there's still a lot of questions about that, how that's happening, or whether we have shared farm workers or so on and so forth. But some of those dairy poultry operations are as far as 20 miles away from each other. So it's a little bit perplexing at this point, and there's still a lot we don't know. The other thing that's been really challenging about this is that the case definition for HPAI in cattle is kind of odd. First, I wanted to point out that there are some folks on this call likely that are on AABP. And, there was a letter that was sent out that there was some concerns about the naming convention around this virus in cattle. So some people have changed the name to H5N1. Some people refer to it as influenza A virus or bovine influenza A. And USDA has been pretty strong on the fact that they want to keep this naming convention as HPAI in cattle because it's highly pathogenic avian influenza in poultry, right? But it's actually an opportunistic infection in cattle. It's not a primary cattle disease. And so I think from a trade perspective, they'd really like to kind of keep that naming convention as HPAI in cattle, but you may see it referred in different ways. So I just wanted to mention that here. Really what we're seeing is the identical strain to what we're seeing in wild birds and what we've continued to see for the last 2 years, which is that Eurasian lineage goose clade 2.3.4.4b, exact same clade, but we do see like minor changes. So when they do those whole genomic sequences, they are able to track kind of what direction it's going and where. And I'm not an expert in that, but Mia Torrischetti at NVSL is. So if anybody's really interested in that, we can certainly get your questions to her, and maybe Dr. Snekvik can also help answer those. But our case definition is super vague. So I don't think there's anybody on this call that's ever seen a dairy cow that hasn't had a drop in milk production, a reduced appetite, maybe some thickened milk because of that reduced milk production, and lethargy fever. Super vague clinical signs, so it's made identifying these really difficult. And so likely we've had cases of this circulating for quite some time. I don't think it just happened. It's probably been, we're guesstimating even as early as the fall, we may have been seeing some spillover, but we weren't recognizing this and we didn't know what it was. So a lot of things have happened. I mean, we didn't even know this was spilling over until just a few weeks ago. And in that time, a lot has unfolded, but there's still a lot of information we don't have, and there's a lot of questions out there. But what we do know is that, it's an animal health event, and it's self-limiting in cattle. So unlike other species where it causes mortality or mass mortality like it does in poultry, we just see about 10% morbidity, plus like 1 to 20% depending on the herd. And that just means those cows get sick and then they recover. And we're seeing on serial testing that those cows tend to clear the virus from the milk in about 3 weeks, maybe up to 4, but they're pretty high CT values at that 3-week mark, and they may be starting out with CT values in the low teens. And so we do see them clear this. It is self-limiting, and so most dairies right now that are impacted aren't heavily calling. They're waiting that 3 or 4 weeks until those animals come back into production, and they're guesstimating around a 10-pound drop in milk production. And some of them fully recover, some of them don't, but they do come back to some degree. I think what's really challenging about this virus is that it's really hard to know how to handle a disease outbreak when you don't know exactly how the disease is being transmitted. We know there's evidence of that point source infection between wild birds or waterfowl to cattle, but we're not exactly sure how it got in there and why it's, in the udder and, what exactly it's doing. But we do know that there's the point source infection from wild birds. And then from there, there's been evidence of lateral transmission from infected cattle moving to other dairies and then infecting other cows in that dairy. And we could be talking about infected asymptomatic animals that look completely normal, go into a herd, and within maybe 2 to 3 weeks, they start to see clinical signs in a small group of cattle, maybe in a completely different pen. So we've seen some of these cows move, be completely asymptomatic, maybe a couple cows get sick, and then everybody recovers. That's kind of what we're seeing. But we know that's a possibility. And so we know that it could be lateral transmission, through truck traffic, visitors, workers. We don't really know, but there is some thought that mechanical transmission may be playing a role through the milking unit. So that gives us something to start with. And as I mentioned in some of the other slides, we aren't sure about that kind of poultry to cow, cow to poultry transmission, how that might be occurring, but likely through a lateral transmission pathway. So as many of you know, on April 24th, that was Tuesday, USDA dropped a federal order. And basically what they were trying to do with that is to slow this thing down. I think what was happening is initially they got a lot of data and a lot of samples, and all of a sudden some of our industry was like getting nervous, and I don't blame them. I don't think any of us do. There's some fear factor around what might happen. And so, I heard a few people say, well, maybe I'll just shoot, shovel, and shut up. I mean, that's what people do when they get scared, right? So if they don't know what's going to happen and they don't know how to get out of something, often people are very reluctant to report. So I think USDA took a different approach. They weren't getting the data they needed to make the decisions that they wanted to make. And so they wanted to reduce the risk of further disseminating this virus because they were seeing it spread from state to state. And they really wanted a mechanism to be able to understand the extent of how common it is out there. Has this been going on for a long time? Has it been circulating? Do most herds have HPAI already? Is there some evidence that it's circulated before and they've recovered and we just missed it? And then also there's a lot of concerns from the poultry industry of saying like, well, what's actually going on out there? And if they want to know, is the dairy industry or these affected dairies a risk to their operations? So I think there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of interest in trying to protect all of our industries and protecting that ability to be able to trade. So I think one of the things that is of interest to everyone is that this has been a challenging disease from the beginning. because this is not considered a foreign animal disease in cattle. This is considered an emerging disease. So it's a foreign animal disease in poultry. So that gives us the authority to go in and respond in the way that we would through stamping out and through depopulation. But when it comes to livestock, it's an emerging disease, not a mandatory reporting disease. So that kind of put USDA in a tough spot, because it's like, well, you can report it if you want to, but we don't have the authority to make you report it. So now they've kind of gone in this different direction to require reporting of this disease when detected at either a non-lab or a private veterinary laboratory. So there is a requirement in this federal order, and also a requirement for testing for pre-movement. And we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. This is the language that came directly out of the federal order. And what they're asking for is prior to interstate movement. So just to reiterate, this is only for interstate movement, state to state. If animals are moving within the state, this does not apply. So it's important to emphasize this. This is for lactating dairy cattle only. So any non-lactating animal is not included in this order. So lactating dairy cattle are required to have a negative test for influenza A at a non-laboratory. And that's what Dr. Sneckvik's on today, because he's our guy. He's going to make this happen for you, and he's ready for it. So that's just to kind of give you an outline on that. And then what they want is they want to require these test positive farms to give epidemiological information. And I'll just explain where this is coming from. So they would get a test positive from a herd. The herd would recover, and they're like, I'm out. And they'd go back and be like, hey, we need more epi information to better understand this disease and how it's being transmitted. And the dairies were like, no way. Like, I'm moved on with my life. I've got enough to deal with. My cows are better. I'm moving on. So, but it left a lot of data gaps for USDA. So I'm pretty sure that's why this was put in here into this federal order, because they need that information so that they can better understand the virus, so that we can figure out what we need to do. What are the best science-based next steps to take? And then, of course, lactating dairy cattle moving interstate must adhere to conditions. What are those conditions? We'll go over some of that, but really, I mean, lactating dairy cattle already are required to move on a CVI. That hasn't changed. They're required to have individual official ID. That hasn't changed. They're just kind of going to reiterate some of those points that's required. And then we'll go into some of the details next on the classes of cattle. So as far as exemptions go, all beef cattle are exempt from this federal order, non-lactating dairy cows. So we're talking dry cows, we're talking springers, we're talking heifers, bull calves, bulls, anything that is non-lactating is exempt from this order. So testing requirements and or movement requirements, and we wouldn't, they can change that at any time, but right now we're focusing on the high-risk group of cattle, which are lactating animals. And then lactating dairy cattle can move direct to slaughter without a test. But the crux to that is direct to slaughter means from the farm to the slaughter plant. They're still working through some things on public livestock markets. And so that's what I wanted to say. This is an evolving situation. And right now they're wanting pre-movement testing for public livestock markets if you're moving them to a public livestock market out of state. So in other words, if your producer has dairy cows here and they're going to move them to one of our local markets, to Chehalis or to Enumclaw or to Stockland or Central Washington or Everson or Toppenish, those cattle would be exempt from that movement pre-test movement requirement. But if you're going to send them to a market out of state, they want that pre-movement testing to be done, even on cull lactating dairy animals. So I just wanted to put that out there for the group. As far as the testing for interstate movement for lactating dairy animals that are going on to be milk cows, for example, what they're looking for is for those tests to be taken, those samples to be taken by an accredited veterinarian, a licensed veterinarian, or a designee. So we can approve someone or under the direction of a veterinarian. So if you're on the farm and you know the milkers and they're familiar with how to take samples, or you want to do a train the trainer and show them like, this is how we want to do this. What we're looking for is them to take a sample, put a little bit of milk from each quarter into one tube per animal, so 3 to 10 mLs, and Dr. Sneckvik will probably cover this better. But I think the important thing is that is a really big win for us, and we really went to bat for this one, is you only have to test 30 animals from any group. So if you're moving 1,000 cows out of state, it's 30 animals. If you're moving 30 animals, it's 30 animals. If you're moving 300 animals, it's 30 animals. So it's 30 animals, no matter what. If you're moving onesies, twosies, then it's onesie, twosie. You got to do them all. So I just wanted to make that clear. I think that'll make this a much more palatable for everyone to be able to comply with. And then that sample collection and testing must occur within 7 days of movement. And that is a little bit of a concern. I think there'll be some flexibility there, but Dr. Snekvik is ramped up and ready to take your samples and get you test results rapidly. And I'll let him speak to that. And we must send those samples to a non-laboratory. So I suggest that we send all of those to WSU WADDL. The second part of the federal order is mandatory reporting. And what that looks like is right now, we already have that in place with WADDL. So they already mandatorily report any reportable disease to us. That's not a problem. We have that in play. One of the problems they were having in other states is that there's private laboratories that were doing this influenza A testing, but not reporting. So this federal order is requiring them to also report those positive or non-negative tests to USDA. In our state, we already require these types of emerging diseases to be reported to us. So many of you know in our WAC 1670, we have like hundreds of diseases that you can never memorize that are reportable to us. And if you want to look at them all, you can get on there. I can send you the link, or maybe Ben can put it in the chat for you here. But right now for emerging diseases, veterinarians are already required to report any zoonotic diseases, any newer emerging diseases, any diseases that appear in a new species, or any unusual high morbidity or mortality. And so this disease sort of fits into all of those things. So this is definitely a reportable disease here in Washington State anyways. We also have the RAD database, if you're not familiar with it, Reportable Animal Disease Database, that you can enter all the information. And there is a drop-down menu for illness that says, you know, something like unusual disease or something like that. I can't remember what it says right now. But if you just Google WSDA RAD database or RAD, it should come up for you. And if you need that link, like I said, we can get that in the chat for you. So for any cattle that do test positive, so we're doing a pre-movement test, we have asymptomatic herd, and we get a test positive. What does that mean? Well, USDA said what that means is whether they're clinical or not, if you test positive, they are ineligible for interstate movement for 30 days after the last sample. So you take a test, those animals are positive, they can't move. And then they have to sit for a minimum of 30 days, get retested. If they retest positive, that resets the clock. They have to sit for another 30 days. So what that would look like for us is one of our field veterinarians would come out, we would issue a quarantine, do the epidemiological investigation with you to try to figure out what's going on. But USDA is mandating a negative test prior to allowing movement, and that's for interstate movement. And then also, this is just good practice anyway, but if you have test positive animals, those animals are expected to be isolated away from the rest of the herd for at least those 30 days. But we know that we have a lot of asymptomatic animals in herds, and so we may have more animals in the herd than what are testing positive on that pre-movement test. So for lactating animals, lactating dairy animals destined to slaughter, if they're non-clinical lactating dairy cattle and they're coming from a Washington herd and they're going to a Washington slaughter facility, you don't have to do anything different. Everything is the same as normal book of work. If you have clinical lactating animals, you cannot move them to slaughter, no matter what. And then if we do want to move animals across state lines to go to slaughter, they can go directly to slaughter. So if your client wants to sell them direct to a slaughter facility in Idaho, they can do that. But like I said before, if they go to a public livestock market, right now there's still a hang-up where there's an expectation for pre-movement tests to be done prior to going to an out-of-state livestock market. Still working on tweaking that. I'm hoping that we get some feedback on that and that changes, but that's what it says right now. And we are working with our public livestock markets and our public livestock veterinarians on that. But we're hoping that we can get a change made on that because most of ours are moving between Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And so we have been in contact with the state veterinarians in those states, and we are trying to work on something that's maybe a little bit more aligned with continuity of business for our current model. I did want to mention that we have about 20 some different states right now that have different movement requirements or different statements that they want on a health certificate. So I think some of the states, now that this federal order came out, are kind of pulling some of those requirements back. But I would I would encourage all the veterinarians on this call to make sure you get on www.interstatelivestock.com. You can put in the state of origin, which is Washington, state of destination, and it'll specify what that statement needs to look like or what that expectation is. I know like Pennsylvania has more restrictive testing requirements than even the federal order does. So if you're going to Pennsylvania, good luck, but check it out before you try to move animals because it is different state to state, unfortunately. All right, so next is just kind of what can producers do? These are just some of the recommendations that the state animal health officials have come up with, as well as USDA. And really what we're talking about is implementing our secure milk supply plans or enhanced biosecurity plans on farm. And I think Tammy Edmonds, I don't know if you're on this call, but she works with Dairy Gold with the farm program and has really led efforts in this area and has helped us get 120 plans written, along with some veterinary students under the direction of Dr. Craig McConnell at WSU. And so we're really fortunate that we already have those plans on the shelves of some of our biggest producers who can pull those off and start implementing some of those plans now. We're asking people to monitor for sick animals and to report to your private veterinarian as soon as you can, and then to have all of you private veterinarians report to us so that we can help you with that investigation and get the sampling done and hopefully get some supplies in your hands or support you in whatever way that needs to look like. We want folks to continue to deter birds and wildlife because we just don't know what role they're playing in the transmission, as well as limiting visitors and traffic. And that's all part of that enhanced biosecurity plan that those producers should be able to implement on farm. And then also, anytime cattle are moved, we really want to think about isolating them as best as we can for up to 30 days. We know that's not always feasible, but it's certainly a good practice if it's something that can be done. So I just wanted to mention this again, that the secure food supply plans are probably the most important thing we can do. These plans were developed with foot and mouth disease in mind. And so really these plans have been created based on that model of preventing foot and mouth disease transmission. And we feel like, hey, if we can prevent foot and mouth disease, the most contagious virus in the world, maybe it will work for this too. And so I think it will. So we have worked really hard at getting those plans, as I mentioned, with our partners with industry and academia. So I would encourage veterinarians, if your producers don't already have one of these plans, or even if they do, encourage them to pull them off the shelf and review these plans with them. If they want to write a plan, you can do that yourself with your producer, and you can help them through this process. We can certainly help support that as well, or help, tweak some of those things. And we are waiting to see if we got funding to continue that project this summer with Tammy and Craig and our group to try to help get more plans written. But we really think this is going to be important for disease prevention on farm. And the whole idea with secure milk supply plans is we want to think of the farm as a castle, and we want to put a moat around that castle to keep any virus out. And so it really helps producers think through, like, well, how are traffic getting in and out? How do I control that traffic? How do I decrease my risk? Where do I put mortalities? How do I keep them outside the line of separation? How do I make sure I'm protecting, everything on the inside from everything on the outside? And, one of the things we really want to think about is, that milk house, and we usually try to keep that out of the line of separation, but knowing that this virus is pretty hot in milk, really thinking about that process and thinking about, what are the steps that we're taking along with the milk processor and trucks when we're picking up milk to make sure we're not spreading virus between farms. And so I know that our partners at Dairy Gold have done a really good job with this and have worked really hard at the biosecurity piece to make sure that we're keeping farms safe, trying to pick up single loads whenever possible, and doing cleaning and disinfection as much as possible between farms. So I think the other thing is just minimizing access to wild birds. I mean, one of the things that's relatively new with this particular strain that we're seeing in the Central Flyway is that it's impacting not just waterfowl, but also grackles, pigeons, and blackbirds. We've seen some mortality events, especially in the Texas herds with those species, which we haven't seen before. Those are also birds that tend to access our dairy herds much more easily than waterfowl. So we know there's some reports of waterfowl getting hungry and accessing feed bunks and commodity bins, but boy, we know what a pain those starlings can be. And then also on some of the Texas herds, we've heard reports of, cats getting sick or dying. It's not like mass mortality, so I don't want anybody to panic, but there have been reports of positive cats on some of these dairies. And then also just thinking about birds of prey even that die or end up in water and drinkers, water sources, feed sources. We really want to be cognizant of that and trying to keep those birds away from cattle now more than ever. And then also thinking about if you are a herd that's affected or exposed, taking some additional steps for sure. So if you know you have this virus on your farm, pasteurizing milk that you feed to calves or other mammals is a good idea. They don't know how those cats became infected. Was it from drinking milk? Was it from eating a dead bird? Was it, was it just from being a cat that has other issues? It's hard to say. We don't know all of that yet. But just taking those extra steps. One of the other things we heard that's been really effective in some of the states that have been impacted is their dairies reported that any of those farms that had backflush systems and better sanitation, it really helped. So if we know we're bringing a load of cattle in and we're concerned about that, making sure that we milk that group last, making sure that we backflush that system after those animals are milked to help prevent mechanical transmission. Certainly thinking about PPE and hand washing, that's always important. And we have Dr. Lipton on from the Department of Health. And I wanted to make sure folks knew she was here in case you have any questions about farm workers or extra steps that we might take. But anytime we're handling sick cows, it's the same as any other disease on dairy farms. We want to be cautious around sick cows when we're picking up dead or sick birds. If we have reports of dead mammals, we definitely want to test those things as well. So if you do see reports of those on farm, USDA will pick up the tab on testing dead cats or dead, whatever it is, skunks, raccoons, whatever you find out there, or dead birds. And then also just thinking about handling unpasteurized or raw milk, since we don't really know how that transmission mechanism is occurring and whether there's a risk to public health with that. So we want to take the precautions we need to avoid any kind of contact. We also want to be thinking about not sharing equipment between farms and not sharing workers. So that was one report that I heard in one of the states, is that they had one family member in a farm working on a poultry facility, and the other family member was working on a dairy facility, and both of those facilities were affected. So we don't know what the human role might be in disease transmission, but it's certainly something that we need to consider. And also thinking about what animals those farm workers might have at home. Do they have poultry flocks at home? Do they have other animals at home? And could they be cross-contaminating their workplace with viruses that they might have at home? So I think what's really important, just to come full circle on spillover and our concern about the next global pandemic, is the importance of keeping species separate. As I mentioned in the beginning, we know we have a lot of high-risk hobby farms, backyard farms here in Washington State, where they have, a pig, a rooster, they've got cats and dogs running through their property, they've got, access to wildlife coming in, skunks or other things. And so we really want to keep species separate to decrease the risk of any kind of reassortment event that could occur right now. We also know that HPAI is ubiquitous in the environment, and there's lots of animals being exposed all the time. So just being cognizant of that, but trying to keep the risk low. We know there's a lot of dairy farms. I know, at least when I did private practice, you're out palpating and there's the rooster and 7 chickens. And then, in the back of the barn, they've got 4 pigs because they just want to have them so that they can put them in the freezer later, and their kids got a show animal over here. And so just, working with your clients on that and making sure they understand the risk of having multiple species and separating those out as much as possible. So we know right now that this virus is currently low risk for the public, and CDC has continued to say that. However, they do want to be able to understand this better. They want to be prepared. They want to be able to dust off those flu plans and be prepared to really lean in and respond. We've been really fortunate because we have a great relationship with our partners at Department of Health here in Washington, and we have weekly meetings to discuss response and what that should look like, and making sure that we're keeping each other informed. To date, we've had one Texas farm worker that tested positive with mild conjunctivitis. There's been a lot of other tests done. CDC has been pretty aggressive on this front. They're really trying to do some epidemiology work and collect data to better understand what the risk is to humans and how this disease might be transmitted, and to make sure we're keeping a thumb and a pulse on what's what's happening out there. So if it does become more transmissible, that we're ready to respond. At this point, though, there's really no changes in the genetic markers to indicate that there's any more risk to humans, nor does it look like it's any more transmissible, human to human, for example. So I think right now this is something we're keeping an eye on. We definitely want to encourage PPE of farm workers and always provide it and make it available. We know that globally there's been 13 cases, but still not a lot considering how much virus is out there. So I feel encouraged for the moment. Again, we need to be concerned, but not panic. We are not in the next global pandemic yet. And so we just have to do a measured response and a right-sized response based on what we know now. And so right now, this is really an animal health disease and an animal health event. But we know that this virus can be transmitted to humans or has the potential to be if it does change. And so Department of Health did put together this nice graphic, like a nice one-pager handout that we can provide to you that you can distribute to your clients and farm workers. And this is also in Spanish that can speak to kind of what to look for, what PPE should consider. And I mean, to be real, I mean, we have a lot of diseases on dairy farms, whether that's Q fever, Campylobacter, or E. coli, or Salmonella, or you name it, right? So we know that there's always a public health risk, and maybe more so with other things right now, but we definitely don't want to fall short. We want to make sure those farm workers have access to the PPE they need to protect themselves. So continuing to work with Department of Health, and like I said, Dr. Lipton's on the call to answer questions. Right now, the milk supply is safe. I just saw, and I put it in the chat here before we started this meeting, that FDA has just come out with they got the virus isolation done, and they're really showing that, I'm going to back up here for a minute. So we saw some reports, I'm sure some of you saw that about half or maybe a little bit more of off the milk samples, off the shelf retail milk was testing positive for HPAI, that was pasteurized milk. But what they were picking up on that PCR was inactivated viral particles. And so what they've shown is that they've taken that test result, they've put it into chicken eggs, they've done the virus isolation, and it just came out as being, woohoo, pasteurization works. The milk supply is safe, and we can continue to say that. But we are also cautioning folks not to drink raw milk, especially from animals that are sick or have any clinical signs. We know that there's inherent risk with drinking raw milk, and we're going to continue to send and spread that message. We don't think it's a good idea to drink raw milk. And then also when we're thinking about feeding raw milk to calves or other pets, pigs, whatever you're doing with that milk, we really encourage pasteurization. There's also been an ask to pasteurize dump or waste milk prior to putting it into a slurry. I understand that's not common practice, maybe not a big deal, but it's just something that's been asked. I know not all farms have that capacity, but it's a recommendation. So if we do get a response, or if we do get a positive herd based on one of these movement tests in the state, I alluded to this before, but here are our field veterinarians in the state. I want you to look at their faces. They are amazing, amazing people. You are really fortunate to have a great team here in Washington State. Our field veterinarians are phenomenal. If you don't know them, get to know them, write their names down right now so that you know who to contact if you have any concerns. Here are the people who are going to help you through this process. These are the people that are going to be writing the quarantines. They're the folks that are going to be doing those epidemiological investigations, along with some of our partners at USDA. So this will be a partnership that we work to get this done, depending on what we find when we start doing these tests. But I want to let you know we are here to help you through this process. You're not alone in this. That epidemiological questionnaire is going to include things like the premises information, case information, herd description, what the milking procedures are, animal movements, our operation management, and environmental factors in wild birds. And really what we're trying to do is drill down into better understanding this disease and the transmission mechanism so we can shut this thing down. We don't want to have to deal with this. So we really are appreciating, and we're going to ask for your help with that as the veterinarians who are overseeing these herds, and to help us get the information we need, because the more we know, the better job we can do to stop this disease from becoming an ongoing issue for us here. And I'm going to hand this over to Kevin to speak more on the non-lab of things. Just real quick, I put the landing page in the chat, so you all have that. You can bring that up if you want to follow these cases. They are updating these real time, so as we get cases, they will show up on this map. So I anticipate we're going to see a lot more states turn pink in the next couple of weeks as we get more of these tests in. I also wanted to mention before I hand it off to Dr. Snekvik, We have a very unique group in our state. It's called the Bovine Issues Working Group, where we have representation from all of these groups. And Jack Field's at the bottom because I couldn't find a logo for the Washington Feeders Association, but all of our cattle groups are really leaning in on this effort. We've been meeting almost daily in some capacity to discuss this and work together on what's going to work best for Washington and Washington producers. So I want you to know that these industries have been well represented. We've worked really well together. We've come up with some guidance that actually was used by USDA with this initial guidance, and we're going to continue to give them feedback on the things that we think can work better. And so I just wanted to thank the Bovine Issues Working Group for their hard work and for our partnership on this response. Lastly, we just also want to be cognizant of mental health resources and being able to provide those resources to dairy farmers. We all know, for those folks that are dairy veterinarians on this call, that our dairy producers are under an unsurmountable amount of stress right now between water adjudication issues and fluctuating milk prices and regulatory burdens in our state that are real, and we have some dispersal sales coming up, and that speaks for itself. So I really want to encourage folks to watch out for each other, veterinarians and producers alike, to make sure that we're in a good headspace, and if we're not, to reach out to get the help you need. And that can mean reaching out to me, another trusted partner. WSU has some great resources, so I just wanted to put that out there. And I'm going to stop sharing and hand this off to Dr. Snekvik to answer your laboratory questions. I'm not sure I can get out of this. How do I get out of this? Here we go. Stop sharing. Okay, Dr. Snekvik, it is all yours. You are the star.
Yeah, let's see if I can get to the right screen. Yeah, this is a new program, Amber. So.
No problem. If you want to email it to me too, Kevin, I can share it for you, but I know it's easier when you can work through your own slide set.
All right, now I think I got it figured out. All right, Amber, are you seeing my presentation or the regular screen? I saw a thumbs up, Bruce.
Yeah, we can see it.
All right, so you can see the presentation. Let me get it in presentation mode.
Yeah, it
All
doesn't
right.
look like in presentation mode.
All right, so you can see it in presentation mode now.
Yes.
All right. Of course, when you do that, then everyone else disappears. That's special. So yeah, thank you for hopping on today, this afternoon. I'm Kevin Snekvik, Dr. Kevin Snekvik, the director at the Wash Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab over in the College of Veterinary Medicine at Washington State University. So just a little bit of quick background. So WADDL, the Wash Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab, we actually have two labs. Many of you are probably aware of this, that we have our main lab in Pullman. We also have our WADDL Puyallup in the Puyallup Research and Extension Center of WSU, which is our avian health and food safety laboratory. So most of our testing all of our testing for HPAI cases that we're concerned about is happening in Pullman. The reason being is that we are keeping our avian health lab as clean, in the sense that it's doing a lot of testing for movement and with our avian producers. And just like you worry about biosecurity with other farms, we worry about the same thing with laboratories and cross-contamination. So just to be extra careful, we are keeping our testing in kind of separate locations for separate activities. So those of you that are familiar or not familiar with the National Animal Health Laboratory Network, which is NALM, it's a USDA state partnership between state diagnostic labs across the US and the USDA APHIS and VS as far as the NVSL, National Veterinary Service Laboratory. So this laboratory network was actually established out of over 20 years ago from the after the foot and mouth disease outbreak that hit Europe, and the United States realized that it was a little under capacity for being able to deal with a disease outbreak like that, and that was the origins of this laboratory network system. So why is that important? All these laboratories are running standardized techniques. They all use the exact same standard operating procedure. They have the exact same equipment. They have the exact same reagents, and they have laboratory personnel. They're all trained and with the facilities to do the testing. So why is that important? It's so that USDA can look across the entire United States and actually have confidence in the test results from the Pacific Northwest as well as from the Southeast, and be able to compare that data. And that really helps our epidemiologists that are out there trying to figure out what's going on, especially in a disease situation like this where we don't have all of the information. All right, so Amber already showed you this map here of the high path avian influenza detections in cattle. Us at WADDL are doing a sweep of both Idaho and Washington, so we've been involved in those Idaho cases, and we'll be also covering all of Washington. So what testing is going on? Real-time PCR testing, so basically that's looking at the genetic material, obviously from inside the virus. We're actually running 3 tests. But for surveillance testing, we'll be running just the first one, which is the matrix test. And so what that is looking for the gene that forms the protein coat of the virus. Why do we use that one? Because it doesn't change over time. So while other pieces of that virus is constantly mutating and changing, that matrix has to stay stable for the virus to be viable and transmissible. So that's why we use that as our screening test. That's followed by the hemagglutinin gene test, which is that H5. And H52344B is specific for the current outbreak that's been going on for the last 2 years. So some people have asked, why are we using this test on milk samples and not other samples like blood and other types of tissues, that sort of thing? And the reason, at least in the cattle, is that's where the virus is at. We, for multiple weeks prior to really understanding what was happening, we were getting samples from multiple tissue types across these cattle, and it's really in the milk. So we are not, when we have paired samples, meaning the samples from the same cow as far as blood, tissue, and milk and feces, we looked at all of those, and really it's definitely holed up in the milk. All right, just a real brief primer on PCR testing. So what we're looking for is amplifying the genetic material that's there. So oftentimes you'll hear people talking about CTs, which is the threshold that the cycle threshold that the sample goes positive. And the more virus that's there, the earlier that threshold happens. So it's kind of an inverse process, that the earlier something happens, the more virus is there. And what we're seeing in cattle is that we're usually picking that those cases are becoming positive after 12 to 20 cycles, which is what we consider a lot of virus in there. So, all right, so real kind of going back through testing and what samples we need. It's milk right now, but what we need is individual cattle sampled, but a composite sample from multiple quarters there. So we only need 3 to 10 mils to actually get all that testing done, and just go ahead and use the mastitis tubes you have around, or other tubes. If people need tubes, we can get that to them, but you don't think you need to really go out of the way. They don't have to be sterile tubes, but we do need something that would preferably have a screw cap, but that's not required. I know a lot of the mastitis tubes and other milk collection tubes are snap cap. That's fine, we'll deal with it. But really our big ask is don't put tape or paraffin or other things around those lids. That becomes a real mess when you're trying to work with those samples with gloves on. Just a reminder to always double bag your samples, so if they leak in transit, that they don't cause a problem, and you can ship those on freeze packs just to keep things cold. And I'll be touching on the session form in a little bit here, but obviously put that into a bag separate, so if something does leak or the freeze packs weep a little bit of fluid just from being cold, that it doesn't get the accession form all wet. So Amber already touched on this, the farm sampling where it's less than 30 lactating cattle, just you sample the number of cattle that are there. As she mentioned, if there's 2 or 3, you get 2 or 3. If there's 29, you take 29. If there's 30, or it's 30, but above that, it's always 30. So just to reiterate that, and that's really helpful on our end as far as kind of reducing the total volume of testing that's going to be happening here. I'm going to try to share with you guys our screen. So hopefully you guys can see our homepage right now. We are in the process of, this will be changed within the next 48 hours by Monday at the latest, and will be a touchdown, what they call a hero page for HPAI testing. It will end up going into to a page that has areas for information for submitting samples, not just from cattle, but also from wildlife, other livestock, birds, and then quick links to the federal links like the USDA that's tracking things nationally. What we're going to be doing is, if you are going to be submitting samples, obviously feel free to reach out to us. We have developed a dedicated submission form, which will be on the web for samples coming into the laboratory. So it's, and I see I have the wrong one up here, but that's okay. You're going to have there'll be one there. It's already pre-filled out as far as what testing you need. That's already done. It's just a matter of putting contact information and sample numbers in there, and we'll take care of it from there. Just so I'll come back to this, but the testing is covered by the USDA at this point, so they're covering the testing, but the shipping part is not. So I just want to bring to everyone's attention that we do have discounted shipping through WADDL. You have to set up an account on our portal, but you don't have to use it other than kind of going into this client page and hitting shipping, hitting Pullman shipping, and if all goes well, it brings up the UPS label page here. Super straightforward. You just literally fill out this information, and it generates a label you can slap onto the package for sending samples over to us. It's running, so this is overnight shipping. Next day it's $20 to send samples that are less than $3. So that should hopefully reduce costs for you and producers is the goal. Back over here to my presentation. All right, so we kind of talked about the session form and shipping and our web page. So again, just it'll be ship samples overnight to us, refrigerated. We cannot test anything that takes longer than 96 hours to get to us. So just as a heads up on that. Currently, we're testing Monday through Friday every day. If samples arrive, we'll get them tested. Typically UPS arrives by noon, so we will start those samples the day they arrive and try to get them out, as long as we're not overwhelmed, which we're not calculating to be at capacity in the near future. So the testing turnaround time, which has been put out in the federal order, is 1 to 3 calendar days. So just take that into effect as far as weekends and things like that. But if you have sticky situations, always reach out to us. We're here to try to do best for our producers and you as veterinarians. So if we need to work something out, let's just talk through it. Just so folks know what our capacity is, we can run 1,500 tests per day. We have the staff and reagents to do that. Each of those tests is actually the pool. So if you took that did the math on that, that's over 7,000 animals in a single day that we could be testing if we needed to. The NALM laboratories meet every week on Fridays and sometimes even more often. So we actually have a direct connection to the vendors that supply our test reagent kits and things like that. So we, even just today, those vendors were on the call and they were showing us what their stocks of supplies were for the entire nation. So there's currently, just today, They have over 1 million tests waiting to be sent out. That's not all the tests that are in the NALM laboratories already. So the capacity is out there to really respond to this situation. Just a reminder on costs. So most of the costs are covered with the exception of shipping. So obviously, if you have clinical animals, talk to, definitely need to report those, and we'll get those tested under the Foreign Animal Disease Investigation Funding, which is always in place. We can take care of that. And then our both lactating interstate movement, that's covered with the exception of shipping costs. And Amber, just as a heads up, on an on call, they were talking about that Canada was going to be matching some of our movement testing, and that we could actually use those federal funds for movement into Canada. And I'll kind of blow by the non-lactating, get dairy cattle, because don't worry about those. And I will stop there. And if there's any questions about what on the testing side, more than happy to answer them.
Kevin, Dr. Snekvik, I'm sorry, Dr. Snekvik, Dr. Steiger has a question in the chat about whether we could have false positives or what the potential for false positive results are.
Yeah. No, Dr. Steiger, always a good question. So we cannot say that there's not false positives, but that's the whole point of having. So what we end up with doing is, if we have a matrix positive, we'll also run those other 2 genes. So there'll be those H5 PCRs. And I've not seen a false positive with all 3 of those, but just to make sure, if those do come up, we end up sending those samples off to NVSL, and they do confirmatory testing, which also includes viral culture from those samples. So there's kind of multiple catches there before it actually is determined as positive. What I did hear this morning, Dr. Idle on the call, though, is that if we did have a matrix positive, that would basically put a stop on the premises. And I don't know if that works for WSDA too, but that's what they were talking about on the null call.
Sounds like we don't have a choice.
Let's see, Dr. Steiger, that answer all your question? Dairies need a Prem ID. Yeah, just going to stress that. We definitely need Prem IDs. We cannot message results or release results without a Prem ID. So please grab that information ahead of time.
Bulk tank test validation,
Ongoing.
serology.
Ongoing. They are working on it. I know Wisconsin and NVSL have been working on it. They've been looking at multiple different serology tests. And yeah, and the bulk tank testing would be nice. We've actually done some bulk tank testing, but it's not official.
Oh, good question. Does the sample need to be collected by a veterinarian, or can the owner collect the sample to ship to WADDL? Do you want to take that one, Kevin?
Well, what I read is it's supposed to be a veterinarian, but then there's some squishy language that if there's oversight by a veterinarian, but I'm going to leave that to my SAHO to make that final call.
Yes, I'm making the call. And what I'm going to say is, if your credited veterinarian wants to do it and can, great. If they want to do it under the direction of a veterinarian, great. They want to train the trainer, great. I think the thing is we know that a lot of those farm workers know how to take a sample for mastitis. And so we need to trust that they can take a sample for this. It's not much different. They just need to understand they need to pool from all 4 quarters into one tube. It's not just 1 quarter. But yes, we're comfortable with the veterinarian determining, the accredited veterinarian determining who the best person is to take that sample on the farm. We trust you.
Yeah, just a reminder, one animal sample per tube coming in, so no pooling of animals. We'll do that here at the lab.
Just pulling of quarters. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? So what our plan is we'll post this recording somewhere. Amber Betts is our PIO on this at WSDA. We're going to try to get this posted or send it out in an email link so that others can watch this if they have additional questions. You can feel free to call or email us. Looks like we do have another question. We operate a county fair in Vancouver with an old-fashioned milking parlor. Oh, no. What should we be aware of in using that milking parlor? Well, right now, the way the guidance reads is we don't require intrastate testing, but it's something we should probably work with the fairs on as a next step of what we want those expectations to look like. If animals are moving interstate for a fair, they have to be tested within that 7-day windows prior to going to that fair. I would recommend if people can bring their own equipment, mobile equipment, or, if it's an old-fashioned parlor, maybe they can bring their own can and their own milking unit. But I think we do need to be very, very careful when we're doing milking at a fair. I think there's some extra steps that we'll need to work on, and maybe we should put a little work group together with our fairs to address that issue. But I think it's a really good question, and it's something we need to take some extra steps on for back flushing or washing those units. Or having people bring their own.
I'll just put a plug out there again that if you, as veterinarians, are on site seeing other animals affected, we can cover that testing. So the PCR testing for those, obviously. But just keep an eye out for that. USDA is really trying to figure out the transmission issue that's happening here. So those other animals may be critical in that.
Yeah, and just to be clear too, I'm pretty sure at least the last guidance I saw on like mammals on farms, if you don't have any clinical animal, like any clinical cows, and you just have a dead cat, I didn't think there was interested in just doing a dead cat on asymptomatic herds. But if we have a symptomatic herds, or we have animals that are consistent with clinical signs, they would take all of the samples from a herd that's either a suspect or confirmed. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, okay, Louisa, is there a PPE fund that we can use to ramp up gear and best practices for our dairy inspectors? Been hearing some state inspectors needing to get large pump type, garden type sprayers and sanitizers. Let's talk after, Louisa. So we do have some resources in our warehouse, and also the National Veterinary Stockpile, from what I understand, is available for us to be able to get resources if needed, but probably more so for affected farms. And I know Department of Health, we've also been in communication with them about being able to provide some PPE, at least for affected farms. But for routine work, let's talk offline here and try to problem solve that together. Good question, thanks. So yes, Dr. Sathri, yes, if we have 1,000 cow dairy sale, whoops, I lost it in the chat. Can we pre-sale test 30 cows and the cattle can leave the different states? Yes. And David Hekimovich put his contact information for Gerald Franks and himself if you need a Prem ID number. And just for fun, just so you all know, the ADT rule was published today by USDA. So you can also get your tags. Veterinarians, we still have tags there, and David's done a great job of getting those distributed to veterinarians. So I'll just put a plug in for that as well. Currently testing a small group for export to Canada. I have been in touch with the our equivalent AVIC over in British Columbia, Teresa Burns. They were talking about requiring some testing, and I haven't seen that officially come out. So Kevin, have you or someone from USDA seen guidance from Canada yet, or what they're requiring?
As of this morning, what they were telling us, they were still working on it.
Hey, Amber, I'll drop a link in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
I understand that CFIA is mirroring the federal order requirements.
Okay, and so everyone on this call knows this is Dr. Maura Gibson, and she is your USDA AVIC and my partner in crime on all things response. So her and her team are great as well. Great resource for information. Okay, is everybody ready to go have a weekend and have a party? Step away from this for 5 minutes? Really appreciate everybody getting on the call. Dr. Snekvik, thanks for being here to support this and give all that great information from the labs. Feel free to call or email. We're always checking in all weekend, even though government employees aren't supposed to work on the weekend. We're not very good at that, and we're always available to support our veterinarians. So feel free to reach out to your field veterinarian or myself or Dr. Snekvik, and we'll do our best to get back to you. as quick as we can. We know this is an emerging issue and it's very concerning, and we want to be here to support you all through this process. We also love feedback about, hey, this is working for me, this isn't, so that we can work with our partners at USDA to help get guidance changed in a way that works for everyone, because we know this is a big lift for not just for us, but for all of you out there doing the hard work. So appreciate everybody being on the call. Pay some special attention to all the links in the chat. There's lots of great information there as well. Any closing comments from anybody on this call? Maura, you don't have a bad joke for us, do you? She usually does. But I didn't tell her ahead of time.
Yeah, so what did the mother cow say to the calf? Most people have probably heard this one. This is an old one. It's past your bedtime. It
is past my bedtime. So with that, I love it. Let's close this webinar down. I just want to thank everybody for being here, and we look forward to continue to work on this issue together. We know it's tough. All right, stay well, stay healthy, have a great weekend, and I'm sure we will see you again. We'll try to host these updates as much as we can as new information becomes available. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thanks, Amber. Thanks, everyone. Bye.